Good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for being here. And before I introduce the magnificent Nikki Williams, I do want to draw your attention. There are a lot of great activities coming up in the next few weeks. They're on the screen, I know, but I want to repeat them. On the 10th of October, we are going to be hearing about spiritualism in the Gilded Age. And I interviewed Kathy yesterday, Kathy Sheehan, who is our speaker, and she's the director of the Hart-Cluett Museum in New York. Absolutely fascinating topic, really interesting. So I hope you can join us on October 10th. On the 14th of November, we are going to be welcoming back to Newport the Gilded Age Orchestra, which performed 2 years ago. You're clapping your hands, fantastic group. And they are going to be performing Rhapsody in Blue, which celebrates its 100th anniversary this year. And it was performed at the casino for the first time in Newport in 1931. That's going to be a great night. I think we've already got a lot of people signed up, right? And after tonight's lecture by Nikki, you are welcome to go upstairs and enjoy the exhibition. How many of you have seen it yet? Well, great. Please join us afterwards, and I think you're going to be inspired and learn a lot of new topics. So, our speaker, Nikki Williams. Yay! I think all of you know she's an accomplished exhibition curator. She had a huge hand. She created this exhibit that we're going to hear about tonight. She was the chief person on Celestial City, which won, and I'm really bragging a lot for Nikki's sake, just won the American Association of State and Local Historians top award for excellence. And Nikki went to Mobile, Alabama to pick up that award. She had a huge hand in Gilded Age Newport. She actually, on her way to giving birth, was still helping write the texts. And all of us said, it's enough, stop. So she's very committed. She's got a PhD from Yale in art history, a master's from Harvard, also in art and architecture. She's got a lot of publications under her belt, including being published in Women's Art Journal, the Journal of Modern Craft, and the Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art. And she's got those exhibitions. So we are very, very lucky to have Nikki Williams on our staff, and I know she's going to do a great job tonight. So thank you, Nikki. Keep up your good work.
Thanks, Trudy, for that very kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share little-known stories from Gilded Age Newport, in which animals play a starring role. And these stories about cats and dogs, birds, butterflies, and more form the heart of our new exhibition at Rosecliff, Wild Imagination, Art and Animals in the Gilded Age. Wild Imagination explores how our relationship with animals transformed during the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, particularly here in Newport, set the groundwork for our modern relationship with animals. It was a time when the rise of industry and urbanization destroyed wildlife habitats and destroyed a rural way of life in which Americans had lived alongside animals. But in other ways, we also grew closer to animals. So pet keeping surged in the Gilded Age. Gilded Age activists launched the nation's first animal rights movement. The Gilded Age also saw the popularization of natural history pursuits like birding. And many Americans experienced new encounters with exotic species, thanks to increased tourist travel, marine exploration, and imperialism abroad. Most of the large public zoos in America were established during the Gilded Age, too. So in all of these ways, the Gilded Age shaped the role of animals in our lives today. I hope many of you have had the chance to see the exhibition in our galleries here at Rosecliff, but if not, you still have time. The show will be open until January 12th. And as Trudy mentioned, our galleries will also be open after my talk, so please go up and enjoy the exhibit. On display, we have a menagerie of animal-themed works, from paintings and photographs and film to fancy dog collars and sea creatures blown in glass. Many of these treasures come from our Newport mansions, but we also have objects generously loaned by 15 partner institutions. I hope these pieces will encourage you to appreciate the diversity of the animal world, animals' intelligence, and their important role in history. I hope you'll rethink animals as agents of history with stories, perspectives, and experiences that are all their own. And to that end, my talk will take you on something of a virtual tour through wild imagination. I'll take you through the galleries, which are organized by theme, and in each space we'll spend time with key objects and key animals whose stories intertwine with ours. So first we'll take a look at, talk about how livestock and wild game came to signify a vanishing agrarian past, and then we'll spend time with cats and dogs, who increasingly entered our homes and our hearts. We'll next explore the cultural fascination with birds and butterflies, and then we'll conclude by discussing how Americans came face to face for the first time with exotic creatures great and small, like elephants and peculiar marine invertebrates. So let's begin where we begin the exhibition in Gallery 1, where we discuss how industry and urbanization transformed human-animal relations. We open the show with this peaceful landscape painting by celebrated African-American artist Edward Bannister. Bannister shows cattle idly grazing the hills of Paradise Valley in nearby Middletown, Rhode Island. Paradise Valley was farmland since the 18th century. It remained farmland into the Gilded Age, even as industry and urban development encroached on this area. And that's what made it an attractive retreat for Bannister and other artists of his generation. Paradise Valley preserved a way of life and a way of living with animals that was threatened by urban and industrial change. For generations, Americans had lived alongside cattle, raising them and working them and living off their products like milk and meat. But many Gilded Age Americans were moving to cities and giving up animal husbandry for factory and office work. They began to buy their milk and meat from stores like we do today. These experiences could be profoundly disorienting, and they produced a sense of loss. And that nostalgia for lost kinship with animals pervades Bannister's cattle painting. And if you look closer, you'll notice also that Bannister included a small sign of industrial change. There's a tiny steamship chugging along the horizon. So he's grappling with this changing landscape. And Mabel Norman Serio, who purchased this property in 1898, was also concerned about unchecked urban and industrial growth in Middletown. So as early as 1914, she had the idea to preserve Paradise Valley for future generations as a wildlife refuge. Serio later bequeathed her land to the community in 1949 for the establishment of Norman Bird Sanctuary. So the preservation of wild animal habitat, which gained momentum in the 20th century, had its roots in the Gilded Age. Like raising and working cattle, shooting game was another rural experience that Gilded Age Americans were largely leaving behind. Artist Julian Scott painted this scene of a winter turkey shoot in the country in 1875, when many Americans were buying turkeys at the butcher instead of shooting them themselves. And that was probably the case for the picture's owner, New York merchant Nathaniel Platt Bailey, whose family summered in Newport. Turkey shooting had been a popular Christmas time amusement in early America's rural communities. It involved tying a live turkey to a stump and inviting the young men of the village to shoot it. And then the turkey was the prize for whoever put an end to his life. So here we see that doomed little turkey, and all around Scott included small details that suggest a bygone age, like powder horns and flintlock rifles, which were both obsolete by the mid-19th century. So Scott probably drew on memories from his own boyhood, having grown up in a country village in Vermont. But I also want you to look just beneath the turkey, because you'll notice an entirely contemporary figure. Scott included a Civil War soldier or veteran wearing a Union cap. He feels anachronistically dropped into an earlier scene. The soldier reminds us that Scott lived at a time of precise sharpshooter rifles and human slaughter on an industrial scale, so much less innocent than shooting turkeys for sport. Scott had witnessed firsthand the horrors of the Civil War, considered America's first industrial war. When war erupted in 1861, Scott was only 15, and he enlisted in the Vermont infantry as a fifer. He eventually received a Medal of Honor for valor shown rescuing his wounded comrades. I think that the trauma of the Civil War deepened his and also deepened his culture's longing for simpler days like these of turkey shooting. But not everyone from Scott's generation saw the turkey shoot as a quaint pastime. In the Gilded Age, an emerging concern for animal welfare made the turkey shoot controversial in the few areas of the country where it still persisted. The man you see on the right is Henry Bergh, and Bergh founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1866. He was no fan of the turkey shoot. In the first annual report of the ASPCA, Bergh insisted the living turkey be replaced by a more humane dummy target. Another writer for Harper's Magazine called the turkey shoot, quote, a cruel pastime that should be discouraged by every humane person, end quote. And this outcry grew so strong that in New York, where the painting was first exhibited, the turkey shoot was effectively outlawed by 1900's Lacey Act for the preservation of wild birds. The second gallery in our exhibit, called For the Love of Animals, focuses directly on this rise of the animal welfare movement in the Gilded Age. We open the gallery with period cartoons and articles about Henry Bergh's formation of the ASPCA. Bergh had the support of wealthy and influential allies, including the historian George Bancroft, who was the first owner of this Rosecliff property. Bergh's ASPCA and the many regional societies it inspired aimed to eliminate abuse of livestock, working horses, working dogs, and other animals. Its efforts led to a steep rise in fundraising, education, and legal protections for animals. The Rhode Island chapter of the ASPCA was founded in 1870. And in the gallery, we honor another influential but overlooked activist for animal welfare from Newport County. Sarah Eddy, who you see on the left, was a Portsmouth-based artist, photographer, and activist. Her house and studio were located on Bristol Ferry Road on the northern tip of Aquidneck Island. Eddy came from a Boston family with deep roots in the anti-slavery and suffrage movements, and she carried that torch of reform as a suffragist and animal advocate herself. She helped organize the Rhode Island Humane Education Society, and she gave generous financial support to the Massachusetts SPCA and the American Humane Education Society. She was also a vegetarian long before it was mainstream. And Eddy was a pioneer, too, in her work as a photographer of animals and author of books encouraging their humane treatment. The volume on your screen, which we show upstairs, is Eddy's book, Friends and Helpers, published in 1899 as an instructional guide for teaching children, quote, to treat all living creatures with considerate kindness and to appreciate the services of man's helpers in the animal world. Eddie illustrated Friends and Helpers with her own photographs, making it one of the first publications to harness the camera in support of the compassionate treatment of animals. During the Gilded Age, women like Eddie were largely excluded from the profession of photography, but certain subjects like animals and children were deemed appropriate for women. This is Eddie's later volume, which we also show upstairs, titled Alexander and Some Other Cats. Alexander was her cat. She published it in 1929, but the book was the result of decades of her earlier work, photographing cats like Alexander and gathering anecdotes that demonstrated feline virtues. Eddie wanted to encourage her readers to appreciate cats, to treat them more humanely, and to encourage more compassionate population control methods. In the introduction, Eddie called cats very sensitive, intelligent, and capable of affection. Her cat photographs are whimsical and sentimental, but they're also really craftily composed. Eddie had studied at the premier art school of her day, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where she had developed a savvy pictorial sensibility that she brought to her photographic practice with animals. For example, I want you to look closer at her photograph. At her photograph on the left. I'll just go back for a second. Whoops, will I? At her photograph on the left, captioned Alexander asking for more. Eddie had published this second version of that photograph decades earlier in Friends and Helpers. So she must have thought of these pictures as effective and worth recycling. In both pictures, we see Eddie's beloved cat, Alexander, cast in the tragic role of a beggar cat asking for a drop more of milk in his little bowl. And for many of Eddie's readers, I suspect these pictures would have recalled an indelible moment from Victorian fiction. Think about the famous scene of Oliver asking for more from Charles Dickens' novel, The Adventures of Oliver Twist, in which a poor and starving orphan boy begs the owner of his workhouse for just a little more gruel. So you're looking on the right at George Cruikshank's classic illustration of that scene. And I want you to notice the similarities in composition, in subject matter, and also the similarities in the illustration's titles. Alexander asking for more, Oliver asking for more. What is Eddie doing? I think she's likening the needy cat's experience to the Victorian orphan's vulnerability and suffering from social injustice. And I'll just add that such comparisons that likened animals to children as helpless creatures in need of protection were critical to the success of the early animal rights movement. As historian Susan Pearson has shown, animal activists often entwined the movement to protect animals with the aims and the rhetoric of child welfare. A plurality of anti-cruelty organizations in the US were dual societies aimed at protecting animals and children from abuse and neglect. Eddie, I'll show you another image of Alexander. Eddie also painted Alexander. This painting again is upstairs. And here we see him gazing pensively to the left and off into the distance. Do any of you think that Alexander looks particularly noble in this portrait? Yeah? Well, I had that impression too. So I wanted to unpack what creates that ennobling effect. First, notice how Alexander's long white chest resembles a marble portrait bust. Because of the unique pattern of his coat, Alexander recalls ancient hero busts like this Roman portrait of Alexander the Great. Alexander has a bust-like coat, and I think that implied his nobility and by extension the nobility of all cats. And that may be why Eddie chose to paint and photograph Alexander time and again when she, in fact, owned many cats and could have chosen them as the stars of her activist photography. But I want you to also look now even closer because you'll notice Alexander's pose. Alexander the cat's pose also mimics the tilted head of Alexander the Great. So the neck twisting to the left with head tilted was a hallmark of ancient images of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had a physical deformity, according to Plutarch, that resulted in this tilted or twisting neck. So after Alexander the Great, the twisted neck became so closely associated with heroism that we find it repeated in later sculptures, like this bust of Cornelius Vanderbilt I by Horatio Greeno at the Breakers. Eddie has given Alexander the cat quite the heroic makeover. Eddie's heroizing of Alexander was part of a much broader shift in Gilded Age attitudes towards cats. During the Gilded Age, cats transformed from urban nuisances, urban annoyances, and rat-catching servants into pets who were deeply loved and even sources of familial pride. Another piece in the show that captures this, call it the cultural ascension of the cat, is society painter Charles Chaplin's portrait of 3-year-old Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, son of Alva and William K. Vanderbilt of Marble House. Young Harold appears with his arms full of little kittens, and the title of the painting, The Three Friends, suggests the Vanderbilts saw cats as much-loved companions rather than nuisances or furry servants meant to keep their mansions free from pests. Cats weren't the only animals being elevated to the status of friends and family members during the Gilded Age. Dogs were on the rise too. And this section of our gallery is devoted to exploring how dogs were increasingly kept for companionship alone, rather than as working animals who might be depended on and economically useful to hunt game, herd livestock, or pull carts and sleds. These shifts were happening in part because the growing middle class in the Gilded Age could afford to keep animals as pets. So pet ownership surged during the Gilded Age, and this was one of the most important and lasting changes in Americans' relationship with animals. For many households, a well-groomed dog or cat became a mark of middle-class comfort and status. And for elites in wealthy enclaves like Newport, pets became lavish living accessories and objects of conspicuous consumption. Purebred dogs were the ultimate status symbols in places like Newport. Wealthy pet owners favored purebred dogs and showed them in competitions, like the ritzy dog show depicted here by American illustrator Charles Chase Emerson. This painting is also upstairs in our show. Elites' desires to keep breeds pure reflected broader social anxieties. It reflected concerns about the mixing of different cultures and races, not long after the abolition of slavery, and at a time of massive waves of immigration to the United States. Realize that just as breeding dogs became the height of fashion in the US, the eugenics movement was taking off. The eugenics movement pushed the idea of applying selective breeding standards to humans to improve mankind. And those who were deemed genetically deficient included non-white individuals, the disabled, the ill, and the criminal. It's no coincidence that within 1 year of Francis Galton coining the term eugenics, eu meaning good, genus meaning born, the American Kennel Club is founded in New York City. Dogs are becoming part of a wider preoccupation with good breeding in a nation that was increasingly diverse and experiencing a lot of social instability. One of my favorite purebred dogs in the show is this French bulldog who belonged to society leader Alva Vanderbilt Belmont of Marble House. In the course of our research for the show, we learned that Alva named one of her French bulldogs, if you can believe it, Dollar. Dollar was even more valuable a status symbol to Alva because he was French. Alva loved all things French. French fashion, French architecture, French decor. Keeping French dogs was part of Alva's effort to equal or best the storied aristocracy of France. But she wasn't the only wealthy American for whom owning a pet dog became a way to emulate or compete with more established European aristocrats. This English bulldog, named Heath Baronet, was purchased from a UK breeder by George Gould, the son of notorious Wall Street investor Jay Gould. The younger Gould set a record when he purchased the prize-winning Heath Baronet for $5,000. That's more than $175,000 today. In response to Gould's purchase of such a fine specimen of English breeding, British commentators sounded the alarm that America's crass millionaires were plundering their cultural property. There was so much anxiety in England that one owner labeled her best dog in a show, quote, "not for exportation." And the sign was interpreted as a delicate hint that no Americans need apply. Newporters didn't only spend lavishly to acquire pets, they spent lavishly on their pets. One vignette I want to highlight from the exhibit includes a portrait of Newport socialite Elizabeth Drexel-Laird's beloved Papillon named Hippodale, and a special dog chair for Hippodale that Laird custom ordered from famed French furniture maker and decorator Jules Allard. Here's a close-up of Hippodale's chair. You can see that it's beautifully carved and it's luxuriously upholstered. Laird spared no expense on Hippodale. She loved him to bits and she spoiled him rotten. And I think that Bessie Laird, Elizabeth Drexel-Laird, loved Hippodale really as a kind of surrogate child because her first son had died in infancy, and then her second son was off at school or frequently with nannies, which was pretty common for wealthy kids in the Gilded Age. And Laird was also really miserable in her marriage. She was stuck and trapped in a loveless marriage. So I think that we see a lot of the affection that she has to give getting channeled towards or displaced onto Hippodale. This stunning painting by Giovanni Boldini shows Laird clutching a squirming Hippodale. The painting was too tall to display in our exhibit, but I hope that you'll go see it in its permanent location in the ballroom at the Elms. One thing I really love about this picture is how Boldini wryly captured Hippodale's status as a fashionable accessory. He does this by showing the dog in the same position along Laird's right thigh below her waistline, where a society woman was expected to hold her fan. And here we see Mrs. Russell from HBO's The Gilded Age doing just that. But I also want you to look a bit closer at Hippodale. Do your fashionable accessories typically look back at you? Hippodale is examining his examiner. Our experience of being looked at by Hippodale unsettles his status as a mere fashionable object. And you can just see the little wheels turning in his head. Boldini is kind of feeling his way into the mind of the dog, inviting us to see Hippodale making sense of us, interpreting us. Boldini's inviting us to recognize the animal as someone with his own perspective. And this aspect of the painting reminds me of philosopher Jacques Derrida's influential talk-turned-book, The Animal That Therefore I Am. In The Animal That Therefore I Am, Derrida recounts a similar experience with his Siamese cat named Logos. Derrida is at home naked one day, and he suddenly realizes that Logos is staring at him, staring at his nude body. And this experience of being looked at by an animal feels embarrassing and weird to him because it's rare that we think about animals looking at us. We are so used to looking at animals ourselves. We are the ones doing the observing, gazing at the animal kingdom, and giving animals names and explanations. Today, scholars consider Derrida's essay as having initiated an animal turn in the humanities, meaning a turn towards placing animals at the very center of our research, towards studying them not merely as objects we want to know about or bit players in human-driven histories, but in the words of writer Catherine Hughes, as, quote, creaturely actors who have experiences, stories, and geographies of their own. And in that spirit of recentering animal experiences, I want to take one more moment with Hippodale and just ask you to think about and to question how Hippodale himself experienced the Gilded Age. When I posed this question to myself, I suddenly realized that his life must have been full of constraints and stresses. We can start by noticing how uncomfortable Hippodale appears in Boldini's painting. Laire's gloved hand squeezing him tight is a perfect metaphor for constraint. And also imagine the dizzying whirl of parties that Laire hosted, which were suggested by Boldini's swirling brushwork. Think about the loud music, the deafening music in Laire's ballroom, the suffocating auras of perfumes and cigar smoke. Think of the overly rich table scraps Hippodale dined on night after night. I thought of all of these potential pet stresses and irritants and allergens, and then I noticed that Hippodale has no hair on his stomach. And this is not typical for healthy papillons. Lacking belly fur is often a symptom of stress or overexposure to allergens. So Hippodale's pink skin may hint that the luxuries experienced by society pets during the Gilded Age could also be quite stressful and harmful to them, a kind of unwitting cruelty to animals. And similar questions about the ethics of modern pet keeping were recently raised by an article published in the New York Times. It was published this summer, titled, "Are We Loving Our Pets to Death?" The author made the point that today we pamper our pets with special nutrition plans, special stroller carriers, even dog hydrotherapy. But animal welfare ethicists and veterinary scientists are also starting to wonder if in our efforts to humanize our pets, we have simply gone too far. Because the more we treat pets like people, the more constrained they become, and the more dependent on us they become, and the more health and behavioral problems they develop. There's an argument that pampering our pets today may be physiologically and psychologically traumatic or harmful for them. And I think the same can be said about the Gilded Age, when the trend towards treating pets as family really took off. And this is a central paradox of pet keeping that we've been struggling with since the Gilded Age. So I spent a lot of time with cats and dogs. I think you know where my allegiances lie. But we have many more wonderful animals in the exhibit. We have this section that we're calling Beasts of Business that shows how scary beasts embodied heated debates about wealth and power in Gilded Age society. Gilded Age tycoons were often caricatured as scary beasts for their monopolistic business practices. So here we see, in this cartoon, industrialists Jay Gould and William Henry Vanderbilt satirized as rapacious spiders. Their network of cobwebs is made from the wires of Gould's American Union Telegraph Company and Vanderbilt's Western Union Telegraph Company. We also have a whole gallery called Beauty in the Skies, devoted to birds and insects. Birds and insects fascinated Gilded Age Newporters. Amateur and professional naturalists avidly observed and collected them. Enthusiasts used popular printed field guides and recorded their encounters with species in the wild. The American Ornithologists Union and the Entomological Society of America were both founded in the 1880s. And bird and insect imagery in the worlds of art and fashion reflected this popularity of the natural sciences. On the left is a 17th century Dutch painting of riverfowl that was owned by the Morris family of Newport. But paintings like this became newly popular again in the Gilded Age because of the way they dovetailed with Victorian interests in birding and natural history. And beneath the painting is a masterfully carved table from the library of our property, Chateau sur Mer. It's been carved by Florentine woodcarver Luigi Frulini. You can see two owls perching on its base. And owls were longtime symbols of wisdom, making them appropriate for use on a library table. But my favorite owl in the exhibition is this massive bronze horned owl with electrically flashing eyes. Our fiery-eyed owl was one of 36 giant bronze owls that once adorned the roof of the New York Herald building in Midtown Manhattan, designed by Stanford White, who many of you know also designed Rosecliff. We see those 36 bronze owls perched all along the roof of the Herald's headquarters in this photograph from the Library of Congress. The owl's eyes flashed on the hour and half hour using the new technology of electricity. The Herald had a whole electrical plant in its basement to power its presses nonstop. And the flashing was also controlled down there. It was controlled by a so-called owl lever. A man took that lever and raised it at dusk to awaken the owls, and then a wire carried the current up to the roof and distributed it among the sculptures. This electrical wizardry created one of the greatest spectacles in Gilded Age Manhattan. That whole tableau was orchestrated by the Herald's publisher, James Gordon Bennett, who was also a Newporter. Bennett had a general obsession with owls. He also erected owls on the gateposts of his Newport estate stone villa, seen in this photograph from the 1940s. You can see the owls up on the gateposts on the right. And if you look really closely, you can also see tangled in the naked branches of the trees, the wires leading up to the owls. So these owls also had eyes that flashed. But Bennett really went overboard with the owls on the Herald building. One writer described the flock as an executive committee of wise owls. And I think that Bennett, hoped this flock would symbolize, in a powerful way, his newspaper's pursuit and dissemination of knowledge or wisdom. But what I find comical is the fact that Bennett's Herald was often criticized for spreading scandal and gossip. The Herald was a pioneer of yellow journalism in the Gilded Age, so as symbols of wisdom, the owls lent the paper maybe a kind of false credibility. One more piece that I want to highlight from our Beauty in the Skies gallery is this butterfly costume, believed to have been worn by socialite Harriet Bishop Lanier to a ball in Newport. Butterflies were a popular costume for society women keen to accentuate their beauty. Butterflies were symbols of beauty, particularly in the aesthetic movement. And I found that another socialite named Marion Langdon also dressed as a butterfly for an 1883 ball at Alva and William K. Vanderbilt's New York City mansion. Her escort dressed as an entomologist, and he spent the evening chasing after her with a net. So in our installation, our fabulous conservation and collections care team recreated a Victorian butterfly net and suspended it over our butterfly costume. We also had a lot of fun posing the mannequin to evoke Bernini's sculpture of Apollo running after Daphne, which is probably the most iconic chase scene in all of art history. But butterflies were not the only animals favored by Gilded Age partygoers. Kate Fearing Strong dressed as a cat to the Vanderbilt's 1883 costume ball. Her costume was inspired by her nickname, Puss. Puss was spelled out in diamonds on her collar. And for a hat, she wore a stuffed cat head, and 7 cat tails were attached to her skirt. Clearly, she wasn't reading the books of Sarah Eddy. Lila Vanderbilt went to the same party dressed as a hornet. Her costume included a headdress of diamonds. A similar costume had been recommended for partygoers in Ardern Holt's guide, Fancy Dresses Described, which was published in 1879. Holt recommended a costume with golden wings made from gauze and a velvet cap with eyes and antennae. He also published carrier pigeon, magpie, and butterfly costumes. In an age of very strict rules for social behavior, I think that animal costumes like these hinted that something a little wild remained in all of us. And maybe that would come out after a few drinks at a ball. And speaking of wild things, another extravagant form of entertainment was the private animal menagerie. You're looking at a rendering by American architect Whitney Warren for a private menagerie of exotic animals kept by Newporter Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont in Gray Craig Park in nearby Middletown. It's on display in a section of Wild Imagination devoted to animal spectacles or animal entertainments. Belmont collected exotic pets on the model of menageries that had been kept by old European rulers and aristocrats. He purchased most of his animals while touring India with his friends, the Vanderbilts, and he then sent them back to Newport via steamer, a kind of modern Noah's Ark that was filled with sacred monkeys, birds of extravagant plumage, gazelles, spotted deer, and more. He housed all of these creatures on his Middletown property where he'd ride out with his guests by carriage in the summer. A Newport newspaper called his menagerie the, quote, pride of Newport society. And if you haven't heard of it, that's probably because it didn't last very long. By 1897, so this is about 4 years after Belmont collects his animals, he decided to gift the animals, including this spotted deer, to the city of Providence for its new public zoo, the Roger Williams Park Zoo, founded in 1872. And this photograph comes from a history of the zoo, so this picture shows the deer already on site in Providence. The majority of America's great public zoos, like the zoo in Providence, were founded during the Gilded Age. They reflected a new emphasis on civic education and also the rising scientific and public interest in natural history. Zoos and menageries celebrated America's growing imperial power too, since captured exotic animals represented the conquest of other lands. Belmont's collection of animals was a direct result of Britain's colonization of India, which put India on the map as a destination for moneyed American globetrotters who could then go there themselves and more kind of imaginatively conquer India through tourist travel. In the exhibit, we show this photograph of Belmont and the Vanderbilts riding elephants in British India, aided by unnamed attendants. The picture comes from a section of the show that focuses on Gilded Age travel and empire. During the Gilded Age, improvements to transportation and communication networks, think railroads and steamships and telegraphs, these technologies enabled more Americans to travel abroad and encounter exotic animals like elephants in their native lands. America in this period was also a rising imperial power, acquiring new territories in the Pacific region, the Caribbean, and the Arctic that then encouraged more travel and exploration. American globetrotters memorialized their exhilarating interactions with animals abroad by taking photographs and collecting souvenirs. And these photographs can be very revealing documents. I think they show how Newporters had fantasies of power over animals, as well as maybe power over the colonized people who often cared for and lived alongside animals. All of this colonialism and imperialism created a new language of animal metaphors. In the mid to late 19th century, the term white elephant entered the English lexicon to describe a spectacular but useless and costly thing. You're looking at a white elephant figurine in the show that comes from our collection at Kingscote. The expression white elephant originated in a legend from Thailand that said kings would gift white elephants to nobles who they had secret designs to bring to ruin, because white elephants had sacred status, meaning they couldn't be worked, but they cost a fortune to keep. Critics of the lavish mansions of Newport soon described them as white elephants, as useless and burdensome things. So see how in his classic travelogue, The American Scene, Henry James used the phrase. He wrote, "The white elephants, as one may best call the Newport mansions, make now for 3 or 4 miles," meaning along the cliff walk, "a barely interrupted chain. They look queer and conscious and lumpish, some of them as with the air of the Brandus proboscis, really grotesque, while their averted owners, roused from a witless dream, wonder what in the world is to be done with them." I don't agree with James, but I have to quote him. Of course, many of Newport's private mansions did prove too costly to maintain in the 20th century. They did prove in some regards to be white elephants, and dozens were torn down. Others were given new life as university buildings, condominiums, and public museums like Rosecliff. I wanted to highlight these Gilded Age stories about elephants and the mansions because they form the long history behind our recent installation of majestic elephant sculptures on the lawn of the Breakers. I hope you all had the chance to appreciate these amazing elephant sculptures over the summer as part of our Great Elephant Migration exhibit. That wonderful project, produced in collaboration with Elephant Family USA and Art in Newport, supported charitable efforts in India to conserve elephant habitats and promote human-animal coexistence. There's one last Newport story that I want to share with you from our final section of the exhibition called Into the Sea. This portion of the exhibition deals with the explosion of interest in marine animals during the Gilded Age, which was largely a result of increased scientific exploration of the deep ocean and shallower coastlines. This photograph shows famous marine zoologist Alexander Agassiz at his Newport estate, Castle Hill. On the grounds of what is now the Castle Hill Inn, one of the most luxurious hotels in Newport. The Castle Hill Inn had been his house. Agassiz also built a high-tech laboratory for the study of marine specimens he found in Newport Harbor. So here we see Agassiz sitting at his desk in that lab, surrounded by zoological specimens and assorted equipment for their study and identification. Agassiz and his team studied all sorts of squirming denizens of the deep, is how one article referred to them. And to represent these local marine animals, we're delighted to show a series of incredibly detailed marine invertebrate specimens made out of glass that are on loan to us from Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, which Agassiz led from 1874 to 1910. In his time as director of the Museum of Comparative Zoology, Agassiz oversaw the museum's purchase of 430 ocean invertebrates made out of glass. And the specific specimens that we have on display upstairs are species that Agassiz and his team would have encountered in Newport's waters. These glass specimens were cataloged by Agassiz's personal assistant, a woman named Elizabeth Hodges Clark. Clark was a scientific whiz in her own right. She worked alongside Agassiz at Castle Hill, sorting and classifying marine specimens. And she also contributed substantially to Agassiz's research and writings. Agassiz employed and trained women at a time when they were largely excluded from the natural science professions. I mentioned ornithology earlier. Women were not really allowed to be professional ornithologists. In this illustration from Frank Leslie's newspaper, we see women working as part of Agassiz's team, surface fishing in Newport Harbor at night. The sparkling of the water all around them, depicts bioluminescence emitted by marine organisms. Bioluminescence pointed Agassiz's team towards ideal waters for hunting specimens. In the exhibition, we show how women like Clark, women like those you see in this illustration, played an important role in Agassiz's discoveries, though his contemporaries and later historians tended to ignore their contributions. Lastly, we have colorful sea creature studies made by Agassiz himself over many years. He was an artist as well as a scientist. And we have these weird and wonderful photographs of jellyfish taken on the grounds of Castle Hill, probably by one of Agassiz's assistants trained in photography. These really are astonishing images. You know, I've never seen anything like these in late 19th century photography. The way the specimens float and glow seems almost miraculous. Especially in this image where we see the hand of the scientist dropping down from the sky with a glass rod to stir the specimen to life. He's animating the mass of jam, almost like God breathing life into his creations. This composition reminds me a lot of images of the hand of God from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. You know, images of a heavenly hand shown shooting down from the clouds to miraculously bring life to animals on earth. And I think that whoever took this photograph was trying to communicate a connection between the work of the zoologist and the biblical act of creation. So what was that connection? Agassiz and many of his contemporaries believed that studying the animal world would reveal God's designs for nature. They were influenced by the ideas of natural theology, or the study of the natural world as a path for understanding and appreciating divine design. For Agassiz, science and the Bible complemented each other. They were not contradictory. So I read this photograph as so much more than a scientific or photographic record of a specimen. I read it as a meditation on the miracle of divine creation, the miracle of animals. And I wanted to end here as a reminder for us today to appreciate the wonder of animals. The exhibition has been a joy to put together because I've learned so much about the astonishing intelligence of animals and the limitless ways that they've contributed to our lives. And with that, I want to say thanks to everyone here for coming tonight, and thanks to the animals in my life who inspire my awe. His name is Puck, and he's waiting for me at home. And I look forward to speaking with many of you upstairs in the galleries. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nikki, for a really wonderful lecture. And would like to open it up tonight for Q&A. So please raise your hand. I'll come around with a mic. Please use the mic so that our friends on Zoom can hear us.
As far as the spoiling the animals, I believe in the 1974 movie Great Gatsby with Robert Redford, they showed a party for dogs, which I think emulated a party that was actually given by Mamie Fish and Harry Lair, I believe.
Yeah.
This further emphasizes having fun with your dogs and your pets. What about on the negative side, when the pets became ill? Were there any vets in the area back in that era? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. I want to go back and look through Newport directories and see if there were veterinarians in Newport. I actually don't know a whole lot about the origins of veterinary science, so that's now a rabbit hole that I'm going to go down thanks to you. But you're mentioning the dog party in Great Gatsby, which was inspired by a party held by the Lairs, Elizabeth Drexel Lair, owner of Hippodale, and her husband, Harry Lair, at their mansion, Arlay. I forget the year exactly that it was held, but basically, they had the idea to throw a party for dogs because they felt that other Gilded Age entertainments had grown stale. So they invited over 100 of their closest friends with their dogs to attend, and the dogs came in costume, in fancy dress, just like their owners. And a trestle table was set out on the back lawn, full of doggy treats. There was, I remember, fricassee of bones and other really kind of inappropriate things that dogs probably shouldn't be eating, things drenched in wine and spices and the like. And I remember, just on the point of animal cruelty, I remember Lair writing in her book about the Gilded Age that there was a little dachshund, a little doxy dog who ate himself into unconsciousness. And he had to be carried out of the party. And on one level, that's funny, but on another level, it's also a little disturbing because you know that something has gone wrong. And that's just, I was thinking about that a little bit when I was, making my point about Hippodale, that to be a dog in the lap of luxury in the Gilded Age was maybe not the best thing for him.
Hi, my name's Christine. I just had a question on whether or not if you knew if the dog ever actually used the Jules Allard chair. And is it the original upholstery? It's
not the original upholstery, which suggests that he used the chair. And in fact, we conserved the chair recently for the exhibition. So I showed you a photograph of the chair in the installation. It was being conserved right up to the beginning of our show. So the other images, the professional photography that we had the chair was a little outdated. It showed a much yellower finish to the wood. We realized in the conservation process that the wood was painted a much clearer, crisper white. So that's why I had to show you an installation view. No, sadly, no, I wish.
Hi.
Hi.
In one of the earlier slides, there was a photograph of what appeared to be Newport with a parade of elephants.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure.
picture?
I'll try to get there. Maybe I can do it this way. Can get there really quickly. I think it was in the front of the presentation here. That photograph shows elephants from Barnum and Bailey's Circus parading down Broadway in Newport in the early 1900s. One subject that we treat upstairs that I didn't have time for in the talk was the Gilded Age is the golden era of the American circus. And the American circus traveled all over the country. It came to Newport many times. And we found wonderful photographs of circus animals parading down Broadway.
Hi, Walter Ayers. Had to ask, no horses?
Horses are up, again, you can only fit so much into 45 minutes, so I hope.
When you talk about Belmont, you have to talk about horses.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's why the animal menagerie is such a shock to me, because we all knew about Belmont's love of horses, but we didn't know about his love of spotted deer and antelope and the like. So we do have a small section on horses in the final gallery of the exhibition, where we talk about how working horses really powered America's modern cities. And that's why, horses were a focus of the early days of the animal rights movement, because they were so overworked and overburdened. We also talk about horses and society pastimes like polo and coaching, and how they became really integral to wealthy Americans' social lives in the Gilded Age.
Walter is the chair of coaching weekend this year.
I do know that, yes. Yeah, that's right.
P.S. to the story of the horses. The Vanderbilts were so involved with thoroughbred horses and coaching that I am sure that there were numerous veterinarians around caring for all these valuable horses.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that if the dogs needed them, the women would make sure that the vet would come and take care of the dogs. So that's my PS to that question.
I wonder if they were privately, employed, if keepers had those skills, or if they were, veterinarians, like corner veterinarians we might go to today. I'm not sure, but I will definitely look into that.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. So, hi. Just
to the selectivity you were talking about, was there anything that you found personally interesting, a story or an object that had to get cut?
Cut from the
Or
talk?
or didn't get to make it into the exhibition?
Yeah. Oh, you should see the checklist. The cuts are about as long as the actual checklist. Yeah, I really love the circus material. Upstairs we have a miniature Humpty Dumpty circus with they're small wooden toys that were sold as sets. So you could bring the excitement of the circus into the home. So we feature about 50 pieces from that set that had many more pieces upstairs. And again, we found many images of the circus and advertisements for the circus, many of which we didn't get to fit in the exhibition, but they're just wild. To see elephants parading down Broadway is not a sight any of us saw until last summer.
Thank you again for a wonderful, wonderful talk and for a wonderful exhibition. I would like to invite everyone either to the reception outside on the terrace or upstairs to the exhibition. There's also the gift shop downstairs, which is open, which has lovely gifts for both friends, animal-like and human. So please check it out. We will be back on October 10th for a lecture that is very suited to October, Spiritualism in the Gilded Age, with Kathy Sheehan, who's the executive director of the Hart Cluett Museum. Thank you so much, everyone.